Good afternoon, and welcome to the Particular Baptist Podcast. I am your host, Daniel Vincent. You can find us and other podcasts at reformpodcast.com. Also, check out our blog at theparticularbaptist.net. And if you are watching on YouTube and have not yet subscribed to the show, hit that subscribe button and the bell to be notified when any new videos, content comes on the page. All right. So we are diving into more Sinclair Ferguson today. I know I've been looking at him quite a bit lately. There is, I think, quite a bit that's helpful from Sinclair, and I think there's some things that are not helpful. Sinclair, we'll be looking at the latter today. I actually came across this by accident, quote unquote, by accident, as I was perusing on Twitter. It was a clip from Sinclair Ferguson put out by Ligonier Ministries, who's being interviewed by Ligonier Ministries, and he was talking about the word and sacraments as means of grace. And there was something interesting that came up in there where he was talking about means of grace as a carryover from the Roman Catholic Church, and that caught my attention as he was talking about this in that context, because I think you're going to find traditionally in Reformed circles that when we talk about the means of grace from the sacraments and the word, we certainly mean they are a means of grace. We would never say that because that's a Catholic carryover, therefore we wouldn't call it that. And I thought this would be a good topic to address as we look at the sacraments as a means of grace. And I want to focus specifically on the sacraments and looking at this from a Reformed perspective in the historical tradition and some of the biblical perspective as whether it is a means of grace. So I want to play a little bit of the clip. I might play the whole thing. We'll see, where he talks about this principle. And I want to see if you can catch on to what he's trying to say here as it relates to means of grace and the sacrament, and see if you can pick these things up. We'll bring up the video here. Play a little bit here.
Roman Catholic theology emerging especially in the later Middle Ages, tended to speak of grace as though it were a substance. So language that many Reformed Christians use, the means of grace, we speak about the Word of God, the sacraments as means of grace, is actually a hangover from the medieval period when, if you wanted the grace of God, the means by which you got that grace was the 7 sacraments. And the grace was almost packaged in the sacraments, so that, for example, in baptism, it would be infused into you. And so it was made almost a kind of abstract commodity on the one hand, and it was formulated virtually exclusively in terms of the sacraments. Without the sacraments, you couldn't get grace. There was no other way to get grace than the sacraments. What made the breakthrough for Luther and for Calvin and the early reformers was that they recognized that grace isn't a commodity that one person, because of his ordination, can pass over to another person. The grace of God is actually found in Jesus Christ. It's in a person. You actually do not need sacraments to receive the grace of God. You need Jesus Christ. And
so we'll stop there. I think that covers what I wanted to look at from that video. But you can see his language here is critical of the Reformed using the concept of the means of grace, or many of the Reformed, as he says. And he seems to have a problem with that because of its tie-in to Roman Catholic theology. And if you do look at Roman Catholic theology, especially in the 16th century, and maybe even before that, because he's referencing Luther, you do see a concept that arises where the sacraments contain grace, and grace in some manner is communicated to the person receiving it by virtue of the thing itself, right? And you'll see this language ex opera operato and things that have to do with the thing itself rather than it just being an instrument by which grace is communicated. But I think that Brother Ferguson, although well meaning, I think he's wrong to say that the means of grace, or the concept of the means of grace, is problematic for Reformed Christians today as it relates to the sacraments of the word. And because our conversation is about sacraments, we're looking at the sacraments. I think from the Reformed tradition, you see this concept of means of grace being used in its proper biblical sense, certainly not in the sense that you find in Roman Catholic theology. And I think that you're going to find that there is this problematic notion with eliminating this idea of means of grace. I think there is this overreaction. Oh, it's Roman Catholic. We shouldn't be using that. We're going to be critical of it. And that's a problem. Just because it has a carryover from Roman Catholic theology does not mean that it's problematic. And if you want to use as a fellow deacon of mine, a fellow deacon at our church said, basically, you want to talk about carryover from the Roman Catholic Church. What about infant baptism, which Ferguson himself subscribed to? So if it's a matter of, because it's Roman Catholic, I'm going to be critical of it, well, then I guess you better get rid of infant baptism, because infant baptism is certainly a carryover from Roman Catholicism, even if there are differences in terms of what it means, right? The principle is certainly a carryover from Roman Catholicism. So I do find it kind of funny that someone would criticize something on the basis of it being Roman Catholic while himself using a Roman Catholic practice. But be that as it may, I do want to look at the Reformed tradition at a very high level and see where this concept of means of grace comes. He says this is a carrier from the Roman Catholic Church. He says that many Reformed use this concept of means of grace as relates to sacraments of the word. But is that really consistent with the Reformed tradition? Do the Reformed even believe that? And I think that what he doesn't do is nuance Catholic theology itself, because there was nuance in terms of what that meant by means of grace. He seems to think that there was only one view, at least from this clip, that indicates it just had to do with infusion by means of the sacrament, and that was the Roman Catholic understanding, when that wasn't the case. There were nuances. There may have been those that believed that, but not all Roman Catholics believed that. Some of them had differing understandings of what that was referring to. And I think it's helpful that we flesh that out a little bit. And that's one of the things on this podcast that I want to try to do, is not just looking at things from a biblical perspective, not just being a Bible study, but looking into our tradition. We claim that we're Reformed. We're claiming to hold to a tradition that we believe is confessing the faith, right? We're not saying that everything taught in that tradition is necessarily biblical. It's not an infallible tradition, but we believe that it has those basic tenets of the faith, and that it talks about those things of Scripture consistently. So we should be able to refer to that, and I want to recover that, and I want to put those things front and center for people. So we'll be looking at some of the historical documentation. Sister Christie, I see you asked a question. Is he saying that we as Reformed believe the means of grace are infused? No, I don't think that's what he's saying. I think what he's saying is that that's what Roman Catholics believed. And I think what he's saying is that because Roman Catholics believed the sacraments to be the means of grace, or a means of grace at least, that we shouldn't be using the term means of grace relating to the sacraments, because he's criticizing that terminology being used by the Reformed because of the tie to Roman Catholicism. So no, he wouldn't believe that the Reformed are saying that the means of grace means that grace is infused into us, because you got to understand from the Roman Catholic perspective, when they're talking about the infusion of grace, they're doing so from a salvific standpoint, from a soteriology standpoint. They might be referring to sanctification in some way, but I think what they're going to be doing, the Roman Catholics are talking in a salvific way, right? When they're talking about means of grace being infused. And again, there's going to be nuance there, as we'll see in just a second. But hopefully that answers your question. Good question. All right, let's take a peek here. So if we're looking at Turretin and Turretin's Institutes, excellent resource. You can buy the hard copy volume sets, or I use the Logos version so I can copy and paste and do word searches and everything. But excellent resource for things like this. And he has a section on the sacraments, and he specifically talks about the sacraments and means of grace. He specifically addresses this issue as it relates, especially as it relates to Roman Catholicism and salvation. So he talks about some nuances as it relates to Roman Catholic understanding of the sacraments. So this is from pages 51 through 55 in, I think it's volume 2 of, oh, I'm sorry, I'm looking at the wrong source here. I think this is from page 362 from volume 3 of his Institutes. I was looking at the wrong source. All right, so he says this, quote, "However, although there is a great diversity of opinion among the Romanists concerning the efficacy," and he's talking about the efficacy of grace by virtue of the sacraments, he's saying there's great diversity of opinion among them. They don't all agree on how grace is affected into the person by virtue of the sacraments. Although there is a great diversity of opinion among the Romanists concerning the efficacy, some maintaining that the sacraments contain grace as the effect in its instrumental and effective cause, which produces in the soul a disposition to receive it, others by an inherent created quality, as medicine is contained in a vase or a vase, according to which they are physical causes of grace, others by an assisting virtue, because, being employed by God according to agreement, they produce and confer grace, and thus are the conditions and causes. Others explain it in other ways concerning which, and he refers to some different Roman Catholic resources. And that's one thing I love about Turretin is he goes into, quote, frequently goes into his opponent's sources. He doesn't just necessarily say, well, this is what they believe. He likes to go and say, well, here's you can go read this heretic or go read this person, and here's the page numbers, and here's who said this. So you can go and study these things for yourself. But basically what he's saying here, to sum up, he says there is a great diversity of opinion among the Romanists concerning that efficacy. So the effectual nature, the efficacy of the sacraments as means of grace in bringing salvation to someone, there's great diversity of opinion among what that means. So Ferguson doesn't nuance the differences in papist theology in this clip that surround the sacraments as means of grace. And I think in terms of just looking at these nuances, I think that is important to the conversation. Turretin says here right off the bat, some maintaining that sacraments contain grace, which produces in the soul a disposition to receive it. So there were those who didn't even believe in an infusion of grace by the sacrament, just that it contained grace and it changed the disposition of the person taking it to receive the grace, but it didn't actually infuse grace into the person. So you can already see that Ferguson is not saying enough here in terms of the nuance of the historical tradition here. And I think this is important, one, because he's not representing history correctly as it relates to the Roman Catholic tradition. But I think, too, that if we're going to say that the means of that they are saying that salvation comes by the sacrament itself, and yet you have people that are Romanists that are saying, no, that's not really the case, then I think it lessens the problem for utilizing the term means of grace by the Reformed, even though they would have never used it in the way the Romanists did in any of these senses. But I think that it lessens that problem if you can see it in its proper historical context. If you see it in the way that he understands it, then yeah, you can see it as, certainly see it as more of a problem. And Christy, you're very welcome. Glad that was helpful. So Turretin is kind of bringing these things out here. So basically, I think Ferguson is saying too much about the situation, and they weren't, all in agreement on that principle. And then you'll see Turretin, he'll go on to say this. He says, still all agree in this, meaning all the Romanists, all agree in this, that the sacraments contain grace and are its vehicles, and that is actually wrought when they are lawfully administered. And they assert that they confer it proximately and immediately and ex opere operato. That means by the external action. So the person taking the sacrament is receiving grace by virtue of doing that thing itself, right? Taking the sacrament itself. And for this reason, the council remains satisfied with general expressions, asserting indeed that the sacraments contain and bestow grace, but defining nothing as to its manner, in order to conceal the diverse opinions of the scholastics, and so balance words that no party could complain that prejudice is done to it, sporting after the manner of actors. So Turner is saying here is that the manner in which grace is conferred to the person is deliberately concealed. So even in all these different understandings, they were very generic in their language. They didn't want to specify, okay, I believe this, I believe that. They're not defining anything as to the manner, right? So in all these differing opinions that he just said, in all of them, they believe that grace is in the sacrament and that grace is conferred to the person in some way by virtue of doing the external act of eating and drinking of Christ's body, right? But they're not saying how. How does it get into the person? What does that mean? Well, we're not going to talk about that. And he even talks about the scholastics. So this could be those who were in the medieval times, even maybe Thomas Aquinas or Duns Scotus, or you're seeing it apparently, according to Turretin, there was diverse opinions there as well. So the Roman Catholic Church has not been consistent on sacraments, apparently. And again, I think that there are problems here with Ferguson not addressing nuance in some way. So you do see that principle from the Roman Catholics. Now, Turretin does talk about the means of grace in the sacraments in some sense. Now we're looking at the positive action here. So Ferguson thinks that Roman Catholics merely believed in an infusion of grace by virtue of the sacrament. We've seen that's not necessarily the case. Maybe some did, but it seems that broadly speaking, that wasn't the case based on what Turretin taught. And he thinks that we shouldn't use this concept of means of grace. But we're going to see here from Turretin, from the London Baptist Confession, the second one, from the Westminster Standards, from William Ames. I mean, these are major Reformed documents and writers here, that they saw the sacraments, the Lord's Supper in particular, as a means of grace, as a help, as an encouragement to people, right? So I want to just briefly take a look at this here. So Turretin again says, now the sacraments can be said to act in us objectively in three ways. Now, I want to back up a little bit here. When I'm talking about the sacraments, I should clarify. I don't think that Turretin is just talking about the Lord's Supper here. The sacraments, I think he would include baptism in here. When we get into the Second London Baptist, we'll look at the Lord's Supper, and the Westminster will look at the sacraments in general. But I think it's important to point out when we're talking about the sacraments, at least from my perspective, I'm looking at baptism and the Lord's Supper. So I just want to clarify that. But Turretin, he says, now the sacraments can be said to act in us objectively in three ways. A, they put us in mind of their author, which moves us to piety and reverence. B, they recall to the mind the cause impelled by which God instituted the sacraments, which fills the mind with a deep feeling of gratitude. C, they bring before the mind the thing itself for the sealing of which they are intended, inasmuch as it can be done by a sign which confirms faith, increases hope, and promotes sanctification. So you can see here that there is a sense where the Sacraments are doing something to us, not by virtue of the sacrament itself. The sacrament itself doesn't contain grace. It isn't itself gracious. It's something that is a means that God uses to help us in our Christian walk. It promotes sanctification. It confirms faith. It helps us to have gratitude towards God, right? By taking of the sacrament. But the thing itself does not do anything. And certainly ex opere operato, that the external act itself isn't effectualing anything, right? God is working through those things, but the act itself does nothing. In the same way in 1 Peter 3:21, where we see that it says that baptism saves. Well, that baptism doesn't do anything in and of itself. And even Peter points out that the washing of water doesn't do anything, right? It has nothing inherently in and of itself, any kind of spiritual significance, or I should say spiritual power. It certainly has significance, but it does not have spiritual power in the water itself, right? He's very clear about that. And so that the same thing happens with Lord's Supper, same happens with baptism. But they are means that God uses to grow us and to point us back to Christ. And I think that's the most important thing, is that the way that happens is not by the sacrament itself, but it's by pointing us back to Christ, right? And that's what Turretin says here. They put us in mind of their author, which moves us to piety and reverence. They recall to the mind the causes impelled by which God instituted the sacraments. So the sacraments themselves are pointing us back to the one who gave them. We're not looking to the sacrament for grace. I'm not looking to the sacrament for those things that God is giving to us in the new covenant. I'm looking to Christ for those things, and the sacrament just reminds us of those things. It's a sign. It's a sealing. It's a recalling of those things. It reminds us. It's a remembrance. It's a memorial, but it's pointing us back to Him. And in doing that is, a means of grace. It's a means of grace. Our confession of faith, if you're Reformed Baptist, the Second London Baptist Confession of Faith, chapter 30, paragraph 1. Chapter 30, paragraph 1 says this: the supper of the Lord Jesus was instituted by him the same night wherein he was betrayed, to be observed in his churches unto the end of the world, for the perpetual remembrance and showing to all the world the sacrifice of himself and his death, confirmation of the faith of believers and all the benefits thereof, their spiritual nourishment and growth in him, their further engagement in, and to all duties which they owe him, and to be a bond and pledge of their communion with him and with each other. So the sacrament of the Lord's Supper in our confession of faith is said to confer grace, inasmuch as the items listed above, that God does use them to help us grow spiritually. And again, it's pointing us back to Christ, right? It's instituted by him to be observed in his churches, the inner for the perpetual remembrance and showing to all the world the sacrifice of himself and his death. So it's about Christ. It's not about us. It's not about the sacrament. It's pointing us back to Christ. We're focusing on him as the source of our sanctification, as the source of our salvation, right? It's not replacing Jesus Christ. It's a means to help us remember Christ. And in doing that, it is a means of grace to us, right? So it's spiritual nourishment, growth in him, right? That's how it helps us to grow. It points to the things signified where grace is truly found. Okay. And it's interesting, too, in the very next paragraph, in paragraph 2, the confession says that the Lord's Supper is only a memorial, which leaves out any notion that grace could be in the sacrament itself. Okay? It's clearly used to help us in our walk, and therefore is a means of grace, but it is a bare memorial, right? It helps us to remember, because a sacrament does nothing in and of itself. Again, that's what the Roman Catholics believe, ex opere operato. You do the external work, you're going to get the thing, because the action itself, by receiving the sacrament, you are receiving grace, because grace is in that sacrament, right? So even though the term means of grace, it may be used as a carryover. It might be a carryover, and it probably is in terms of the words, But the principle couldn't be any more different than what we find in Roman Catholic theology. The Romanists were clear that saving grace was contained in the sacraments, while the Reformed saw God working through the sacraments for the spiritual good of their recipients, and that would be by pointing us back to Jesus Christ. Okay. And again, this wasn't because of doing the external act itself, ex opere operato, nor was grace in the sacraments, but God working through them according to his will. So this means that when our confession of faith talks about our sanctification coming by virtue of Christ's work, this is not inconsistent with that, because all this is doing is pointing us back to Christ's work, where that sanctification can be found, right? Where that sanctification can be found. It's just pointing us back. It would be like a pastor reminding the people of God about the gospel. And in reminding them about the gospel, he's pointing them back to Christ. But it's doing so through the means of the word, right? It's pointing us back to Christ by means of the word, where that grace and sanctification is found. Not found in the sacrament, it's found in Christ. So it's pointing us back to the source of those things. That is really the difference between, Romanist understanding and an understanding is found in the Reformed tradition. Now, if we look at the Westminster longer catechism or larger catechism, I think it's a longer catechism, question 161 and 162 follow along these same lines. Question 161, how do the sacraments become effectual means of salvation? The sacraments become effectual means of salvation not by any power in themselves or any virtue derived from the piety or intention of him by whom they are administered, but only by the working of the Holy Ghost and the blessing of Christ by whom they are instituted. So God is the one working here, not us by doing some kind of external work pointing to a thing rather than to the creator of the thing, right? Again, it's always pointing back to God as the source of the grace, not the actual sacrament. Question 162, what is a sacrament? A sacrament is an holy ordinance instituted by Christ in his church to signify, seal, and exhibit unto those that are within the covenant of grace the benefits of his mediation, to strengthen and increase their faith and all other graces, to oblige them to obedience, to testify and cherish their love and communion one with another, and to distinguish them from those that are without. That last one is interesting. Because I think that when you look in 1 Corinthians 10, I believe it is, where Paul talks about participating with demons, right? Criticizing those who would go to some sort of pagan feast just because they think they're getting a free meal or whatever the case might be. And Paul is saying, no, this is not just a meal. This is a meal that's done for the very specific purpose of worshiping an idol, which is demonic. It signifies a particular religious practice. So in the same way, the Lord's Supper signifies a particular religious practice of the people of God. And it says, and exhibit unto those that are within the covenant of grace. So it's distinguishing from those who are without. It's a particular practice of God's people as opposed to everybody else. So you can see from the Reformed tradition, and I guess I don't have aims here. I thought I did, but that's okay. I think I've hit some of the major points here from the Reformed tradition, but you can see this consistent language throughout all of them, through Turretin, Second London, Westminster Standards. You can see this core understanding that the sacraments don't have anything in themselves. They point us back to the source, and God is the one working, not us, in terms of the grace being the efficacy of the grace. So if we look biblically speaking, we say, okay, you've looked at this from the tradition of the Reformed, but are the sacraments themselves a means of grace? And we'd say, yes, absolutely. I think, and I mean, so biblically speaking, are the sacraments a means of grace? And yes, if they indeed are meant to help strengthen and increase grace in us, then it has to be means of grace, a means that grace comes to us, right? Again, not by virtue of the thing itself, but by pointing us back to the one who gave the grace in the first place. It points us back to the source, back to the source. So it's a means of grace in that regard. They help us in our walk with God. And you can see this, like if you look at 1 Corinthians 11, you can see this implicitly, at least. 1 Corinthians 11:27, Paul is giving in 1 Corinthians 11 is giving instructions on this sacrament of the Lord's Supper. Therefore, whoever eats this bread or drinks this cup of the Lord in an unworthy manner will be guilty of the body and blood of the Lord, right? So the implication is if I eat and drink of this properly, then I will be blessed spiritually and even physically speaking. There will be some sort of blessing there because there are people who were dying because they were abusing the Lord's Supper. Otherwise, there will be spiritual and maybe even physical harm. So the table is meant to bless the people of God by its eating and drinking properly, and it's to help us grow in Him and be spiritually nourished. And then with baptism, I mean, if you ever go to a baptism, there is joy in that, right? You see someone being baptized, it reminds us of what Christ did, that we're being buried with Him. It points us back to Him. We're encouraged, we're nourished spiritually. We desire to follow Christ. Hopefully, we're desiring to obey Him and live for Him, as we're being reminded as Christians of that basic truth that the death of Christ has saved us, that we've been buried with Him and we're rising to new life, right? It's pointing us back to Christ, right? And so we need these things. We need the sacraments, right, as Christians, to be encouraged to walk according to His word, to continuously be reminded through the word, which is a means of grace, reminded when people are baptized, reminded when we take the Lord's Supper, those things that Christ has given us to help us remember what He did. And that helps us to grow, and it helps us to continue to persevere. So again, I know I talk about this frequently on the show, but it's dangerous. It's certainly not good to neglect the Lord's Day, because that's where the means of grace are demonstrated. That's where the word is preached. That's where the table is administered, and baptism is displayed when it is called for. And so as Christians, we should be willing to be part of that, right? As much as we can. And so these are gifts that God has given us to help us grow in our walk with the Lord. And it does bother me, when I hear those, when you hear something like that, what Ferguson is saying, that the means of grace is not helpful language, when these are gifts that God has given us to help us in our walk with the Lord. Why would we hinder those things for Christians and seeing them as, oh, but we can't be, that can't be something that God uses to help us because that's Roman Catholic. Like, no, we should embrace them. We should love them because they are reminding us of what our God has done for us and pointing us back to Him and making us more like Him. And they nourish us spiritually. So hopefully that's been helpful. Just some food for thought and just some things to consider as we go along in our Christian walk. There will be no episode next week. I am teaching at my church on July 7th. I'm actually going to be teaching on Christian nationalism. And so I need the time to focus on that. But Lord willing, the following week, we will be back at our regular cadence. But with that, everyone, thank you for joining me today. I hope this has been helpful, and Lord willing, we'll be back soon. Take care.